when you describe like people opting out of VS Code in the modern day, I think the inverse is actually kind of happening where VS Code, if you look at GitHub Copilot, it's ripping off the concept of what Cursor does more and more and more every single day. Like, I think if anything, Windsurf getting acquired was a smarter move because the technical moat of what a cursor is getting really slim. It's a distribution moat. But all of a sudden, like, if Microsoft's just looking at moves, copying them, they're a little bit lower quality for now. So I'm not going to switch back to VS Code. But in this context of like a corporate software engineer, you look at VS Code, you see, oh, this new agentic mode thing is kind of neat. You click on it. How would you ever discover a cursor? Or why would you ever move to its cursor? Where Cursor and Anthropic, they're going to get like, maybe not now, but maybe in a couple of months, maybe like the context of years, they're getting pinched from kind of both ends, right? They have this competitor on the side in OpenAI, and they have the like looming cloud on the horizon that is Microsoft, just looking at everything that they're doing and imitating.
Don't you think? Welcome back to the Scholar AI Founders Pod. Quick reminder to catch us on all your usual podcast locations and find us on our YouTube channel. Today we are talking acquisitions in tech, some movement in the markets, and some other things. So, Akshay, throwing it over to you first. Some of the major news coming out of the last week or so is OpenAI has now officially acquired Windsurf. For those just catching up, Windsurf previously went under the name Codium, and basically they are a coding agent similar to Cursor. They have significant market share. They've had significant. So, as someone who I think maybe all of us on this call now are fairly frequent Cursor users, I'm curious, like, have you tried Windsurf? Do you have an AB? And then what are kind of your overall thoughts on this acquisition?
Yeah, Windsurf got acquired for 3 billion, I believe, officially this past week. So I tried Windsurf once. I think a lot of the tech sphere just kind of rides on the coattails of general opinions about like, this is the hot AI tool. I hopped on Cursor ended up being the one that kind of stuck with me. At the time that I tried Windsurf, it didn't really beat my expectations for Cursor, so I never really stuck with it. But it's always kind of been like, in my perception, most natural competitor to Cursor. The space for coding AI tools has been really, really crowded and has been getting more and more saturated. There are all sorts of versions, doing all sorts of interfaces, but in the space of IDEs, it was always Windsurf and Cursor. And so they finally got an acquisition, which is pretty interesting given that like this territory is still so young. I would still consider like Windsurf, even though I'm sure the company is quite a bit older than the overall AI hype wave. Windsurf as a product has existed in common conversation for maybe like a couple of months. It hasn't been that long, and their acquisition was gigantic, which is really, really impressive. And I think it also leaves a lot to ask about like, I'm sure Cursor got the same deal. Was it smarter to take the deal? Was it smarter to not take the deal? That I think is really interesting in the context of like what you see with happening with Microsoft and GitHub Copilot and the way it's evolving. So I'd love to hear y'all's reactions first before we kind of get more and more into it. But it's really interesting. I always kind of look at them as like kind of second on the list in the IDE space. But the acquisition, I mean, of course, huge congratulations to them. That's a really big deal. It's a really big amount of money for something that's still so young.
I don't blame them at all for cashing in and taking the exit, putting the win on the career scorecard. I totally get that. And once you kind of open the door to that, the non-founders, executives, kind of employees, everybody starts to sort of start counting the zeros in the bank account. So it's once that momentum starts, it's very hard to slow it down or stop it or reconsider as the founder, even if, in your heart, you might not want to do the deal. The kind of organizational momentum from going through the due diligence leads you to just kind of move forward and accept the deal. So both Cursor and Windsurf are branches of VS Code, which is open source. And it's really interesting that kind of from a core open source product, making your own variations of it, your own flavor of an open source project can generate this kind of wealth creation and market value. And so I've seen a market estimate of Cursor's value being about 9 billion given this acquisition based on the amount of usage that Cursor gets compared to Windsurf. I know some people who love Windsurf, but by and large, software engineers that I know are using Cursor. So it seems like, at least in my anecdotal experience, it feels like a 10 to 1 or 20 to 1. Maybe in reality, that's more like 3 to 1, but Cursor does definitely, I agree, feel like the leader. And there's a natural kind of partnership that emerges between Anthropic and Cursor now, because Anthropic has been the go-to software development model and Cursor has been the go-to software development IDE. And now with MCPs and kind of the role that MCPs, model context protocols, play in kind of connecting these systems, all these kind of software systems together flexibly, there seems to be now that creates space for a very natural partnership. The most important question that sort of comes out of this is, well, what changes for a software engineer who's been using Cursor or Windsurf now that OpenAI has this ownership position? Will Windsurf only use OpenAI's models? I wouldn't think so. That doesn't seem like the right strategy to me, to narrow Windsurf down to only OpenAI's models. But if you're not going to do that, then what's really the point of the acquisition? What does OpenAI get out of this? It's not going to be revenue, you would assume, right? There's no amount of traction Windsurf could get that would make a dent in OpenAI's financial projections. So this is not a purchase for financials. This is a purchase for some kind of traction and user base. But how do you translate that into some kind of compounding value for the new owner? I don't get that. What would you do if you're OpenAI? Do you only use your own models in Windsurf?
Damon, you go first. I do have an answer though.
Yeah, short answer, no. To me, there's a couple of, I think, interesting things. Just answering that question first, you just use it for the data that the users provide, or you buy instant distribution. You understand that coding is one of the more prominent and the most profitable current, or at least most revenue generating use case inside of these AI agents, and you use the recursive data loop, that is increased usage of the system, to improve your foundational models relative to Claude or relative to whatever the benchmark coding model is. Basically, what you get in acquiring this tool, this IDE, if you will, is you get direct visibility into which model the auto feature is selecting and which model the user is selecting, and what of those two in that hierarchy gets the most code acceptances. So you basically create this entire new stream of distribution and data pipeline, so to speak, such that you can actually build improvement on your code base. This to me signals or reinforces the signal that we speculated about a week or two ago. That is, OpenAI understands they're falling behind in the ability of their model to perform as well as other models, namely Claude Sonnet 3.5 or 3.7, in the regime of coding. And this acquisition is a fraction of their overall market cap, but punches well above its weight class, at least in my understanding, in its ability to rein in a market that they're losing ground in. And they probably see it as somewhat existential on their app base to lose that particular cohort. Because as everyone starts to build with these AI tools, the APIs, etc., if they lose the developers, they're going to lose a significant kind of toehold into the overall market. And so that's where I kind of see this acquisition fitting in. In the broader sense, I think Microsoft is probably also an integral player here because Microsoft owns VS Code. And I think we are very short in the days where people are going to stick with VS Code instead of Windsurf or Cursor or some of the other open source forks that are going to come from VS Code, GitHub, Copilot, etc. Like, we're all headed for a world in which all of our IDEs are agent infused. And so Microsoft probably played a role in just simply saying, we're not long for VS Code. We need to ensure that ownership or that investment somehow. This makes a lot of sense to do. So, Lakshay?
Yeah, I think there's kind of two things at play here where we look at Anthropic and we look at Cursor, and I kind of agree. There's kind of been this like implicit handshake between the two of them as products. Even though there's no like formal brand association, I think just by virtue of having one of the best developer models for the longest time, and also being the leader in developer experience, the two of them have had a very tight relationship for a long time. That was making the developer like mind share on Anthropic centered as a universe, right? And so OpenAI, they've been making moves outside of this Windsurf acquisition. They've even tried, they announced just this past week that their deep research tool, the thing that can take like 5 minutes to get you really, really deep answers from crawling the web, all that sort of stuff, they're going to add connectors to that. And the first connector they want to add is GitHub. It obviously, like, I think they're very much registering that like developer mindshare is something that kind of spreads out from SF, spreads out from New York, kind of goes wider out of companies and corporations, where if your developers in your company really like your tool, they will be the advocates of it in the corporations that they work for. And right now, the conversation is just way too heavy Cursor Anthropic, right? And I think in recognizing that like probably the most general amount of like sellable seats, I guess, has really happened in the coding space. It makes a lot of sense that you'd really want to fight for it, given that like maybe in the short term it's not going to pay off that long, but if all of a sudden we're talking about like Amazon as a company by default, most of their engineers use Cursor versus Windsurf. Facebook, same conversation. You end up in a very kind of different space for what it means to be an OpenAI or Anthropic. We're not there yet, but obviously, like that's kind of the objective in the longer term, where you have these orgs of 100,000 something engineers. Getting those people sold on enterprise licenses becomes a very, very big deal. The second part of it is that obviously with OpenAI and Microsoft's like obviously this relationship has gotten more tense in recent time, but there is some level of a partnership there. If you look at VS Code, I actually like when you describe like people opting out of VS Code in the modern day, I think that inverse is actually kind of happening where VS Code, if you look at GitHub Copilot, it's ripping off the concept of what Cursor does more and more and more every single day. Like, I think if anything, Windsurf getting acquired was a smarter move because the technical moat of what a cursor is getting really slim. It's a distribution moat. But all of a sudden, like if Microsoft's just looking at moves, copying them, they're a little bit lower quality for now. So I'm not going to switch back to VS Code. But in this context of like a corporate software engineer, you look at VS Code, you see, oh, this new agentic mode thing is kind of neat. You click on it. How would you ever discover a cursor? Or why would you ever move to its cursor? Where Cursor and Anthropic, they're going to get like, maybe not now, but maybe in a couple of months, maybe like the context of years, they're getting pinched from kind of both ends, right? They have this competitor on the side in OpenAI, and they have the like looming cloud on the horizon that is Microsoft, just looking at everything that they're doing and imitating.
Don't you think, to that exact point, the again, what you get with buying Windsurf is that feedback loop necessary such that you
Mm-hmm.
could make VS Code better?
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Whether you just reskin VS Code as Windsurf or whatever, I guess the central premise is VS Code as the way we used to think about VS Code is dead.
Yeah.
It will go. It will have agentic service. Whether it still gets called VS Code or not, I think is yes up for debate. Why switch the name if people are already comfortable with it? But it is interesting. I also just saw, as a quick tangent too, just added web browsing in their API as well, which
Mm.
I think is interesting. So now, in addition to what you were saying about that GitHub integration from OpenAI, a lot of it remains the best at coding, and now via the API, it can go grab things like API docs or otherwise. Then that's only going to be better.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. Like agentic coding is going to become the default. I think it's just like in the context of what I was saying is like I think VS Code, it's hard to discover now. And again, there's still all these like contracts and such to sign between Microsoft and their clientele. But it is ultimately just like one security audit and approval from a buyer company away from like all of a sudden you have Cursor, but you've never heard the name Cursor.
Yeah, and it's worth pointing out that Microsoft has 49% of OpenAI, or at least did prior to their latest financing. As a private company, we don't know exactly what the cap table says today, but
Mhm.
Microsoft has a very large position in OpenAI. Microsoft DNA is kind of infused now with OpenAI DNA. There are, of course, things Microsoft is going to do to protect itself and keep optionality, even if OpenAI is not successful. And OpenAI will try to maintain its own sort of independence and separation. But there is undoubtedly some shared DNA there. And Microsoft became what we know of it to be today because of big acquisitions like
Yeah.
LinkedIn, for example. So these are the kinds of things that Microsoft does. It does large acquisitions to grow because Microsoft is fundamentally not a product company. They're not good at kind of rolling out, creating new product, and they don't need to for their market cap to grow. They need to just go make smart acquisitions and roll them in and bundle them to the consumer, the end purchaser. So that's sort of the underlying premise that perhaps OpenAI is considering, that maybe some level of Windsurf would be included at the consumer point. So if you have a pro or a plus account with OpenAI, you get some tier of Windsurf included.
Yeah, it would not surprise me if in like 5 or 6 years, like ChatGPT as an app, Windsurf as an app become part of like a developer office suite bundle. You know, like that it makes a lot of
Mm-hmm.
sense that like the way things are going, like GitHub is a native integration of deep research. You have your preferred IDE, that all of this exists in like OneDrive or something somewhere. That's all kind of cross integrated as kind of the first ingestion point for I'm a corporate employee at some company. I have my PowerPoint, I have my Microsoft Word. I also have my Microsoft ChatGPT and my Microsoft Windsurf. And that's how my developers interact with the PRDs and all these other documents that my product managers are pitching or whatever have you.
That's right. Interesting enough, Shashi, built a nice segue there to another interesting topic that we've seen, which is OpenAI's newest fundraise and kind of the corporate gymnastics they're going through right now to originally they were considering becoming a for-profit. The most recent word that I've been able to read and surmise is that they are in fact remaining a nonprofit. Originally there was an investment promise from Softbank that was contingent on them becoming a for-profit. However, OpenAI has been able to remove the investor return cap that was previously in their bylaws, and so that did twofold: in one, remaining them as a nonprofit, and then two, activating the full investment of I think of 30 billion from SoftBank. So Shashi, kick it to you first. What do you kind of think about this transition or lack thereof of OpenAI? SoftBank now being the largest backer of OpenAI, at least in the most recent round. But like you said, we don't know the full cap table, but interesting nevertheless.
Yeah, Masa-san takes big swings. Masa-san is the chairman of SoftBank, and that's his MO. He's taken big swings and hit. He's taken big swings and missed, but he likes to bet in a very bold way. And that's certainly what OpenAI is at this point. It could create the kind of home run that no one else in the world could create if is successful in a certain way. It could also create the kind of miss that no one else could create if they entirely implode. So it is definitely a Masa-san style bet. Whether it's going to be successful or not will really depend on how much economic value OpenAI can create through individual agentic functionality that the market doesn't have today. It can't replace existing functionality that the world has and create that kind of value. It has to create new capability, new technology that just doesn't exist, that significantly expands GDP and economic efficiency and productivity. And if it's able to do that, then its value is going to be nearly infinite. It creates a kind of direct asymptotic slope upward. And if it doesn't do that, then it's going to be very, very hard to justify the amount of money that's gone into it and the burn rate, and then it will decline pretty fast. It's a kind of all or nothing. Go to the craps table and put it on black and see what happens.
Bookshay, any thoughts?
I mean, y'all know I'm not I can't do financial analysis. I haven't read that textbook yet. But I don't know. I mean, I guess like we've talked about this acquisition before, or not acquisition, sorry, the investment on OpenAI before, and the valuation of it being kind of crazy. I think it does feel to me like, I know there are conversations happening historically about OpenAI as a nonprofit versus evolving. I am kind of the stance that they should just commit to the profit thing. I don't know what's holding them up, but like, I've seen it happen to smaller companies before, and obviously in common vernacular, there's a lot of like want for OpenAI to stay a nonprofit serving its traditional mission, but ultimately it's become a product company with a research company embedded in it, and so if it behaves the way it does, like, I think it's totally appropriate that in a due amount of time it becomes fully operating in the traditional sense of what a common SaaS company ends up becoming.
I think operationally it's already there. I think the short answer to your question, though, is I don't think it's technically legal for it to convert to a for-profit company. I think that given the history and given the original nonprofit entity, I think there are at least legal limitations as to what they can kind of quote unquote become. And by effectively eliminating the investor return cap while remaining nonprofit, they have functionally become kind of a company that can drive towards shareholder value, i.e. for-profit company, while still being technically a nonprofit entity, having a nonprofit board, still kind of having a charter to serve the public good, if you will, and those kind of things. I do think there's an interesting tangent here, which is I think this conversion, contrast to the full conversion to a for-profit, probably also helps them skate a lot of the lawsuits against them from Elon and other maybe primary investors or initial investors who were suing to limit the ability of the company to convert to a for-profit entity. Other broad news as far as things changing hands: Warren Buffett stepped down as the CEO of Berkshire Hathaway in the last week or so. Interestingly, the stock shrank a little bit. The price kind of declined following that news. I think that's somewhat unsurprising, but also stark in the sense that a 90-year-old CEO steps down. Typically, that would inspire a stock increase, not a stock decrease. And I think it's just another testament to kind of the unrivaled success of Warren Buffett. I think if you look at the trading history of Berkshire Hathaway specifically compared to like the S&P over the last, 50, 70 years or roughly since he's been running it, it's hard to make an argument that anybody has outperformed Berkshire Hathaway, and kind of by virtue, he and the late Charlie Munger. So I'm curious, Josh, as someone who's in that world quite a lot, do you have thoughts on kind of the stepping down of Warren Buffett?
Buffett's a legend. There's no other way to say it than Warren Buffett will be known as one of those legendary investors. Fascinating to me that he's made most of his money since turning 60. I think the vast majority of the money he's made in his life came from investments after the age of 60. The Berkshire Hathaway stock since 1965, when Warren Buffett took over, shares rose 5,500,000%. Since since his takeover, but the vast majority of that came from the last 10 years. So it's just sort of fascinating to see kind of that trajectory. Interesting that if Berkshire stock went down by 99%, it would still have outperformed the S&P over that time. So pretty shocking.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know what else to add other than that Buffett is going to be a legend for a long time after he passes.
Yeah. Yeah, it's back when I was in like high school, middle school, we used to play like the stock market game, which is just like as middle school, even elementary schoolers, just like especially the kids who end up doing math classes, like it was very typical that like the math kids would be thrown into the stock market game in some capacity or another. And typically the strategy as a fourth grader ends up being just like look up Google, look up Netflix, and just toss the fake money you have at them and just see what happens. But inevitably there'd just be like one or two kids who just like put it all on Berkshire Hathaway and be like just over the course of like a year to see what happens. And inevitably that kid would end up being like second or third place somehow just over the course of 1 year. And it's always funny because at the end of the stock market game, the winners for every school get invited to this like local banquet at like a hotel. So like all of these like 4'6" children are dressed up in like suits and ties, and they're asked to come up and explain what their strategy was. And always there's one kid who won at their school is like, I just put it on Berkshire Hathaway, and then they go take their like slice of pizza and walk back to their table, which is so great. But I don't know, he's like. It's funny even having like known how prolific he was as an elementary schooler. So kind of same remark, like nothing specific to comment on, just like he's prolific for a lot of really great reasons. And it's really funny that even as like an elementary schooler playing with pretend money that like he was having an effect, you know?
I think the interesting thing for me here, that's also a fascinating story, but to think about fourth graders buying and selling fake stock is interesting and on itself, and then also one of them having the kind of foresight to just say like, I'm just gonna back the best stock picker in the world. I can't do this better. Let's just back them. It makes a ton of sense. So that kid's probably doing all right now. But my kind of general question about these kind of things are, I wonder how much institutional knowledge can be passed down, and what the kind of ongoing rate of success or rate of return that Berkshire Hathaway can produce is. We see often that these kind of quote unquote founder led organizations or companies in the transition to new CEO, there is some element of kind of secret sauce, something that just simply can't be passed down through organizational processes that just almost always result in some version of fall off. And so I am very curious to watch the continuation of Berkshire Hathaway in the absence of Warren Buffett to see if there is something that can be reproduced that doesn't demand the uniqueness of Warren Buffett as the CEO.
I just want to add a couple of details about Buffett. So one of the things he and Munger emphasize is that for most people, index funds are the best way to invest your money, and any kind of stock picking beyond index funds is a waste of time for the vast majority of people. What they have done particularly well in the way that Charlie Munger and Warren Buffett have stated their own strategy to be is that they are willing to be very patient, way more patient than most people are willing to be, and they just want to see a lot of pitches. They're going to wait for the right pitch, and when they find the right pitch, they're just going to swing really hard at it, but they're willing to see a great number of pitches before they have to swing. And so that in that strategy, the most important investments that Buffett and Munger made, the top one, investing in Apple. I know this sounds really silly, right? Investing in Apple doesn't seem like a particularly shrewd or unique investment, but they were willing to invest when everyone else was afraid. And they bought 400 million shares of Apple when it was 84 billion valuation. And they just rode that for a very long time. So they find an environment of fear So that one of those has happened really in like the last 6 months. We periodically in the zeitgeist of society, we get to these moments of fear where people are really worried about what the future might be and what it might look like. And it inevitably results in people pulling money out of the market and just being conservative. It's a natural reflex. And when that happens, when everyone's afraid, Berkshire has been very willing to put money on the table and buy. And those are the pitches that they are waiting to see, because when they see those, their confidence in the world re-emerging from whatever created the fear and panic. Sometimes it's a Great Depression, sometimes it's a recession like in 08, 09, sometimes it's war. Berkshire is willing to put money on the table, and that has led them to invest in Apple at 84 billion in valuation. The next two biggest investments, Bank of America at 41 billion valuation. They bought a billion shares of Bank of America when everyone was afraid the banks were going to collapse, and they bought 35 billion of American Express when everyone thought the banks were going to collapse. So when everyone's afraid, they just put in money and they buy in big chunks.
I think directly complementary to that is the opposite, and that when everyone is greedy and stocks are at an all-time high, they regularly go to cash. Leading up to the turn of the calendar year, they were the largest cash holders in the world, at least reportedly, and even currently they're the largest holder of U.S. treasuries, and they have a large portion of their current fund in cash, at least as reported of a couple months ago. And so they consistently are, I think, playing antithesis to the general consensus in a way that has been very lucrative to them over time. Moving past that, I want to talk a little bit about something else that we're seeing kind of in the broader financial markets, and it's related to this kind of idea of investing specifically in the public and private markets, and that is the venture capital model is undergoing a version of evolution in that the traditional VC model is approaching the private equity model, where some of the VC firms are actually purchasing businesses outright. They are infusing their operational expertise, their operational knowledge, helping right size some of these earlier companies, or even mid to later stage companies. Curious, Shashi, throwing it to you first, why do you think there's a trend of prominent VC firms kind of adopting the private equity model? Do you think it is a short-term kind of play? Do you see it being a long-term trend? What do you think's happening there?
The VC market got ahead of its skis. It got overinvested in as a segment, and VC returns went down a lot. So a lot of capital went into VC over the last 6-7 years. A lot of that VC money got deployed, and those companies haven't returned the fund. Basically, the funds have not been able to make a strong return overall. That's just the state of VC. And so what do you do? Let's imagine you raised a fund, you've got 50 million, $100 million, $300 million, whatever amount of money you might have raised. You've got investors who are expecting a return. You're looking at the VC market and thinking it's very hard to deploy money into startups and have that return, because the survival rate is now pretty low, and the success rate of kind of one investment returning the whole fund is not as high as it used to be. The other complicating factor is that AI has created a kind of velocity that you might have had companies survive the winter. Every startup goes through several winters, and companies you would usually have time to kind of go through that, survive it, refactor their product, their go-to-market strategy, and kind of make it through to the other side. And what you're betting on is really teams that are going to go through that journey. The amount of time that those companies have had lately to go through that journey has just been shorter, because people will leave to go to other projects. There's a lot of other projects people can do, or competitors come in, and it's just a lower barrier to entry for competitors to come in and fight you for whatever market you're going after. So every market just feels busy and crowded and competitive now, and so VC dollars just aren't going as far. So if you've raised a fund, you've got a bunch of money to put to work, and your investors expect to return.
I think we might have lost Shashi a bit there.
So one thing you can All right. So one thing you can do if you've raised a fund and you're trying to generate a return as a venture capital company is look for just older businesses that are revenue generating, profit generating, and just try to put a new framework of leadership in, a more aggressive go-to-market, a more customer partnered product function, and you can generate a quick return that way. So I have friends who are essentially doing this with private equity. I have friends who are working with PE companies, going in and buying an established business that's profitable, could be legal or accounting or some other services company that's generating a profit. You take over the company, you get very aggressive with implementing new technologies with which people like the three of us, since we live in this world, we see these new technologies every day. Most people in most markets just don't see these new technologies and what they can do with them. So they don't even know that they can use a voice agent to answer the phone after hours, for example. Like these are just very difficult things for them to conceive of and implement. So that's the kind of approach that some funds, some companies are some venture capital companies are taking is they partner with leadership teams. They go in, buy an established business, refactor it with a new management team to quickly grow, quickly scale profit. That playbook has been used for a very long time, and AI just gives you a brand new kind of wave of tools that you can use in that same strategy.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think the nature of the VC founder handshake. I mean, like again, all this is like social media, like trends and observations. Where I still think like there feels like a very good amount of hype in like what the AI space is in general. That's driving a lot of investment in like companies like Reducto, driving investment in company. I haven't heard of what Lane Chain is up to in the longest time, but I assume they're still alive. But companies of this variety where like pretty raw, like traditional VC investment, on like taking a big bet on a company that is doing something fairly innovative was used to be pattern. But we're also seeing this like kind of trend on the opposite side where even like because of AI efficiency, it's a lot more possible to do less. So it kind of seems like early stage, there's like some reduced interest. Like for example, Greg Eisenberg is a big promoter of this like philosophy on LinkedIn, Twitter, about how far you can get on just like really low capital infusion, building something fairly bootstrapped that can go really, really far. And the other end of it, there's these like companies that are, as Shashi kind of mentioned, like they're really big bets. But for example, you look at Cursor versus a Windsurf, kind of bookending the conversation, right? Those sort of like little bits of competition that end up playing out so strikingly in a space that's moving so fast is just yielding lower and lower returns. Where it does make a lot of sense that like the kind of way that the dynamic would shift is move the VC capital that currently exists, take the same operational efficiencies and take the same like employment categories that currently exist, but apply them to places that aren't effectively SF. Like let that money change things for companies, for cities that aren't SF, that are so hyper unaware of things that like the ability to drive enterprise value is just kind of sitting there because the client base, the company establishment already exists. You just need to take the setting of AI and SF attitude and put it on cities that don't already have it. Take old legacy businesses, make them run from 100 people down to 30, and all of a sudden you've made a 30 times $100,000 salary difference on the bottom line.
I think it's interesting. The theme that both of you are touching on is that this transition is being catalyzed by AI. I do think that's true. We saw a few VC firms kind of prior to this, at least public consciousness of AI generally shifting in this direction. So I think it probably also has to do with just broad diversification of the asset class. Venture returns are more difficult to come by. Historically, they're slightly worse, to a lot worse than private equity returns. I think that just successful firms and anything are going to look to diversify. They're going to look to expand. And I think that AI continues to accelerate that process. I think the points that both of you are making, there's a lot of legacy businesses that previously existed in these kind of silos. We've often talked about, legal practices, dental practices, physical therapy practices, those kinds of things, where those aren't industries that are really ripe for disruption via the typical startup model. You don't really have people that are dropping out of college to go and disrupt the veterinary market per se. But in the world of AI, where the entire value prop is operational efficiency, that can change. That said, what you are missing in those worlds are institutional knowledge. You don't really have founders that have lived a decade in veterinary practice or dental practice, as an example. But what you could do as a VC firm acting as a PE firm is go in, roll up a network of those businesses, improve efficiency across that web using AI, have a dedicated AI team or division that's under your umbrella that can help you deploy those new technologies across those things and get massive kind of economic benefit in that model. I think it works. I think it's really smart. And I think it's kind of natural that you're seeing, especially the largest firms, A16Z and others, kind of trying to execute against those opportunities. I think that it's also indicative, or at least to me, signals that we might also be moving towards the kind of call it the central driving force that has traditionally been the SaaS market. I think there is some growing, at least consciousness, concern that that model might be changing and might in some ways be largely going away. AI may be kind of the great disruptor for the typical SaaS business model, and many of the more successful VC firms especially have been propped up on top of, being able to sell increasingly scalable seats at marginal costs of goods, basically. Great. Let's call it there for this week. Thanks everybody for joining us for this week's episode of the Scholar AI Founders Pod. Quick reminder to catch us next week and every week thereafter on your favorite podcast locations, and find us on our YouTube channel. Thank you all, and see you next time.